Anyway, we'll try and get on some more calls here. Daniel in Victoria, BC. Thanks for waiting.
Hello.
Hi.
How you doing today?
Good.
Good.
Hello.
Yeah,
Hello.
we're here.
Sorry, we didn't answer.
Yeah, this is my first time calling in. In fact, this is the first time I've ever seen the program or listened to the program in real time, so it's kind of interesting.
Well, welcome.
Wiccan. Yeah, thank you. I'm a Wiccan. I'm a retired Wiccan minister, and one of the things that we have in common, both atheists and Wiccans, or maybe even just neo-pagans altogether, is we're quite often persecuted by the mainstream religions to a very great extent. One of the reasons why I think we are persecuted is because we're different. Atheists are different from Christians and Muslims, and both Wiccans are as well. Obviously, we believe differently, or rather, we believe and you lack believe differently. But I just kind of like to explore some of that idea of why there's such persecution for minority religions, atheists, people of different philosophies by the mainstream religions. What is it about them that means that they have to persecute?
Is that a question, or are you asking to further explain your thoughts?
Well, I guess it is kind of a question, yeah. I mean, I'm not an atheist. I tend to have a lot of things in common with atheists because I don't believe in a lot of other different gods and goddesses. But I do experience a lot of the same things, and I belong to a lot of discussion groups, and I find myself using the same arguments that atheists use. And I get the same responses.
I'm not sure specifically about what you think about what counts as persecution, but for me it's kind of straightforward. We are social creatures who are also tribal, who are lazy thinkers, who are fearful of things that are different. And so the safest thing you can do is to pick the people who are like you and make sure that they're supported, and the people who aren't like you aren't supported.
Yeah, I think that's probably pretty close.
Well, but I also think that when it comes specifically, at least to, certain brands of Christianity, I don't know, I can't really speak to all of them, but I know the ones that are most conservative, just as my experience with, meeting people who believe differently, it turned out to be kind of destructive to my belief in Christianity. The idea of encountering doubts and questions that honestly, I was not prepared for, because the doubts and the questions that my church had put forward from the pulpit were not the real doubts and questions that I ended up being asked. And a lot of what they said about other religions, specifically, I remember, I'm not going to go into the lengthy story, but what my pastor was saying from the pulpit about what Buddhists believe. I found out later, this is not what Buddhists believe. And so by trying to inoculate me with disinformation about these other groups, what happened was that when I went out into the real world and I started to meet people in these different groups, I started to realize that a lot of the information I was given, if not all of it, was complete bunk when it came to this is what other people think. This is what this group thinks. This is what this group thinks. And it wasn't what anybody actually thought. And people were far more reasonable than our church gave them credit for, but I think they counted on the idea that they could keep us isolated by saying you're in the world, not of the world, and so you should just limit your interaction with these other groups, and just listen to what we're telling you, read your Bible and pay attention and believe it's all true. When I encountered other things, it was, like I say, destructive, because if your beliefs hold up, right? Like if you're looking at certain beliefs, like in gravity, for example, it doesn't matter where I go or who I speak to. It's very doubtful that my belief that gravity is at work is going to suffer for somebody asking questions about it or trying to tell me that it's not so. But my beliefs on Christianity suffered greatly as a result of people claiming things that I then went and researched in order to defend, only to find that I was wrong and I had been taught something wrong.
Yeah, and that's actually one of the things that is a real thorn in my flesh, as it were, is this whole idea of empty claims. I mean, we get it constantly, and you probably do too. People come on and say, God is real because. In my mind, it's absolutely ridiculous to make a claim of truth of something that you can't substantiate. I don't have any problems with somebody saying, this is what I believe, and I can't substantiate it, but I believe it because of blah, blah, blah.
Why wouldn't you have a problem with that?
Well, I guess it depends. Like, and I suspect that you would say, you know, how do you know your belief is true? Sometimes, to me, my beliefs, and I readily admit I believe 6 ridiculous things before breakfast. Sometimes my beliefs, it's not as important for them to be true as it is for them to be meaningful. And I'll readily admit that I cannot prove what I believe, and I don't think anybody can.
Well, but do you think it's a good thing for people to care less about whether beliefs are true than whether they're comforting or meaningful? Is that a good thing?
I think it depends. I think it depends on the belief. If my belief neither picks your pocket nor breaks your leg, then whether it's true or not may not be as important as whether it's meaningful to me.
Yeah, but the problem here, Daniel, though, is that you have this belief, right?
Yep.
And you came to be convinced of this belief for some reason, right?
Yep.
So if you have a brain that is accepting of invalid, unsound reasoning that led you to a false belief, don't you think that's likely to make you believe other things that are not true?
Yeah. Actually,
and don't you think that that we act based on what we believe?
Yes.
So shouldn't it matter whether our beliefs are true? The fact that you derive meaning from it, you might, let's say, for example, be convinced that, I'll just go with the easy one, really simple, that white people are better than black people. You might be convinced of that and not care whether it's true, but it's meaningful to you. And yet that belief has actions that have consequences, and the reasons you believe that might inform other beliefs. And so if you have, it's like a calculator that's broken. If you're putting, 2 + 5 in and it's giving you 19, well, you might say that's still meaningful to me. But what happens when you want to put in 3 × 4? What happens when you want to try to actually get the right answer? If you've got a broken calculator, if you've got a computer that doesn't have any fidelity in giving out accurate answers, isn't that a big problem?
Yeah, it is. And let me give you like some of my philosophy on it. For one thing, I have always promised myself that if what I believe conflicts with what can be shown, that I will discard my beliefs.
But that's a misappropriation of the burden of proof. Basically, that is, I'm going to believe this until you prove me wrong. And under it actually.
No, let me go a little farther. For instance, I was raised a Federation Baptist, which is kind of equivalent to your Southern Baptist. I was raised to believe that evolution was false. When I got to high school and started taking biology and loved biology, I found out that the creation things that I was told were wrong.
Yeah, Daniel.
Wrong.
Daniel.
So I discarded them.
Daniel, this example is you believed something until such time as it was proven to be incorrect, right?
Yes.
Weren't you still wrong even if nobody ever proved to you that you were incorrect?
I was.
And if you made decisions based on that incorrect information, wouldn't that be bad?
It might, except for, let me say, I have some very strict moral principles involved as well. And one of them is...
Well, if you don't care about truth and you care about whether they're comforting, how do you know you have good moral principles?
Well, isn't that a problem?
Yeah.
My main moral principle is do no harm. So if what I believe in causes harm to somebody, and yet I know that that's a pretty subjective thing, but it's all I got, then I have to discard the belief. That's just the way it is. If I believe that whites are better than blacks, and that is a harmful belief, I have to discard it. That's just
what if you're not convinced it's harmful?
Well, and that's another problem, isn't it?
Yeah, which is why instead of holding this view of I'm going to maintain my beliefs until there's reason to give them up, instead of that, you should reserve judgment and not believe something until such time as there is sufficient evidence to warrant belief. That's how the burden of proof should be applied.
You have a very definite point, and I will admit that. In my case, I believe that my spiritual beliefs, even though I cannot prove them, do me good. So they have a benefit for me. They connect me with my culture. They give me a sense of connection with my ancestors and my history. So they do give me benefit.
I could say that I believe that Chris and I, as beings in the universe, are connected on some level where we can communicate without words or even being in the same area, that there's a connection between us such that when Chris leaves, I can still feel him, and that might bring me comfort. But is it true?
I think you're kind of mischaracterizing what I was saying about that. I wasn't suggesting that I can talk to people who aren't there.
Well, you didn't give a specific thing, and you used the word spiritual, which I have no idea what the hell that means, and certainly not what it means to you. But the issue is, nobody's proven that Chris and I don't have this connection, and if the primary reason for holding it is that it's meaningful to me, and certainly I'm not doing any harm. Am I doing any harm by that, or can we identify any harm? And so, under your model, there'd be nothing wrong with me believing that.
Well, and yeah, possibly it wouldn't be. I mean, like I said, I believe in...
Except that if it's not true, isn't it a mistake to believe something that's not true?
Not necessarily. And for one thing, I'm going to turn it back on you, and I'm doing this intentionally, is that once you make the positive claim that it's not true, then you take on the burden of proof.
I agree. And you also take on the burden of proof when you say that it is true. You also take on the burden of proof when you say, I am justified in believing this because I haven't been proven wrong and because it doesn't do any harm.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you think, Daniel, that it might be good, like when Matt presents me with this idea that he can still communicate with Chris when Chris has left Austin, should I necessarily tell him, what if I don't say to Matt, I think that's not true? What if I said to Matt, I'm not convinced that what you're telling me is true right now? Wouldn't that be reasonable to not believe him, but also not tell him that it's false?
I think saying that I don't believe you is a very reasonable position when somebody else has made a claim they cannot substantiate.
Sure.
And I think that's kind of what's being said here, is the idea
Why
that
don't you
to
say
not
that to yourself?
believe it until you're confronted with adequate justification.
If it's justified for Tracie to tell me that she doesn't believe me, then wouldn't it also be perfectly reasonable for me to say, I don't believe me?
Yes.
Okay. This is the thing we're talking about, is at what point should you be convinced of something? And it cannot merely be because I haven't been proven wrong and nobody's demonstrated that there's any harm in it.
Well, do you also believe that beliefs are necessarily voluntary?
No,
nope.
Beliefs aren't voluntary at all, as far as I'm concerned. You don't choose in any simple sense what you believe. You're either convinced or you're not.
If I do believe something, and I don't have a reason to believe it, but I still believe it, and I'm still open to the fact that I could be wrong, is that not also a reasonable proposition in that I cannot just shut my belief off?
Oh, you cannot shut your belief off, but what can happen is someone like us could explain to you why you are not warranted in holding that position, and then you'll have no choice but to change your mind.
Well, okay, but again, I may agree with you, but whether I can actually change my mind at that point is not necessarily the same thing.
No. You cannot agree with me and not change your mind. You can. So, like, if you said, I believe that there's a spirit in all of us, something metaphysical, something that, whatever. I don't necessarily know because we didn't get to the specifics of your belief. And if I explain to you why it would not be warranted for someone to accept that proposition, you cannot simultaneously agree with me and still maintain that. What you can do is either say you agree with me when you don't, or say you believe when you don't. But if you are in fact convinced that it is unwarranted, I suppose you could also be convinced that you don't need to warrant your beliefs.
See, I think I agree with you, and I wasn't understanding what you were saying. What I can say is, if you give me what is a rational set of arguments, and I will agree with you that they are rational, but I may not necessarily believe that they are correct, then I will still maintain my belief, but I can agree that you are rational, because not everything that's rational is correct. It usually is, but not always.
Do you not care about being rational? So this seems to me to be an objection to, we may not have access to truth, but we can make reasonable inferences that are more or less likely to be truth.
Yeah, and
okay.
I'm not going to say that my spiritual beliefs are reasonable.
Why would you hold beliefs that aren't reasonable?
Well, probably because I'm a religious person, and and you're an atheist. And
yeah, but I wasn't always an atheist. I used to be a religious person, and when it became exposed that my beliefs were not reasonable, I had no choice but to give them up.
Yeah. Because
I care about being reasonable. This is why I asked the question, do you care about what's true versus what's comfortable or what's meaningful? And your position, as stated earlier, seems to be that you don't care whether it's true or perhaps reasonable. I don't want to put too many words in your mouth. If in fact you find meaning from it.
I'm saying that if it cannot be shown that it's false, and it provides me a benefit, a spiritual benefit, and using spiritual in the very esoteric sense here, then I don't see a reason to discard it. And I used the example earlier that
this is the problem. This is the problem: is you are willing to hold things until you find reason to discard them, when what you should be doing is not accepting them until you have reasons to accept them.
I mean, isn't that every irrational belief? I mean, haven't we just described every single irrational belief when someone
every unfalsifiable proposition you would have to accept in order to be consistent?
Yes, but there are also things that are not reasonable that we believe about each other, that we choose to believe until they're shown otherwise. For instance, most people have spouses or partners, and they believe that those partners love them and that they are faithful. And we may not have concrete reasons to believe that, but we choose to.
I don't think that I do. Yeah, you see how your partner treats you, and you can communicate with that person, and you can also see how they act toward you. And
sure.
Yeah,
and how many people have been wrong? I mean, people are wrong.
Yes, feelings can be wrong.
Yes,
and we can erroneously assess someone. But what you're basically saying is that's fine. That's fine if your spouse is abusive to you and you think they're wonderful.
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying it's fine to believe that my spouse is faithful and loving until I'm shown otherwise.
Even if they're emptying your bank account. It's like, this is what I'm saying.
You have evidence for the love of your spouse. You're not making that up. There is evidence for that. Tim mentioned that great quote about, love without evidence is stalking.
Yeah. I mean, just because you're believing the evidence and you're not seeing all of the evidence, you can be wrong about your assessment. But what Matt is saying is, isn't it better to be right? If your spouse doesn't love you and isn't concerned about you and isn't faithful to you, wouldn't you rather know?
Well, yes. But
even though it might be more comforting to go on believing that they're faithful and loving.
Is it Daniel? Is it possible that I could be neither convinced that my spouse is faithful nor convinced that they are unfaithful? Is that possible?
That's a good question.
My answer is yes, if you think this is a trick question. But I
don't think it's a trick question. I think it's a philosophical question.
Well, those are two different propositions. X is faithful, X is unfaithful. I can be unconvinced of either of them. And I could be unconvinced of both of them.
Right.
Right? So, now we start off with a position where I am neither convinced that my spouse is faithful or that they are unfaithful. Your view was that it's okay to be convinced that your spouse is faithful, even if they're not, if it's meaningful and etc. And my thing is the default position is to accept neither of them until you have evidence for it, and you could with acknowledge that you could still be wrong. I could have mountains of evidence that my spouse is faithful, which by the way is an absurd concept anyway. But I could have mountains of evidence for that and still in fact be wrong. But I am reasonably justified based on the information that I have. So I have moved towards a positive position based on evidence.
Yes.
Okay. But if I don't have evidence for that, I shouldn't just accept it. Matter of fact, I don't know that I could choose to accept it or put forward that position. And certainly, if I hold that position, I shouldn't say I'm right or I'm justified in the absence of evidence either way.
Well, what is your evidence?
No. In the absence of evidence for either proposition. So let's say proposition one is there's a diamond the size of Milwaukee on Mars. And the the opposite is that there is not a diamond the size of Milwaukee on Mars. I don't have any evidence either way for that. I can't accept either of those propositions. But if I were to say to you, I'm convinced that there's a diamond on Mars the size of Milwaukee, and I'm justified because it hasn't been proven wrong, and I find it meaningful, am I being reasonable?
No.
Then why would you hold beliefs and advocate for beliefs that you just acknowledged are unreasonable?
I've never once said that I believe that my beliefs are reasonable.
No, but you think that you're justified and that it's okay, that it's a good thing that you believe something which isn't demonstrably reasonable.
Justification and reasonableness are two different things, however.
Justification is part of what determines reasonableness, but that completely ignored my question here.
I believe I am justified in holding my beliefs, but I am not reasonable.
Okay. I have nothing more to add.
I don't think there's anything you can say to that.
Yeah. Thanks for calling.
Okay, well, thank you.
All right.